So scientists are trying to find ways, and I really want to emphasize there's lots of research all around the world, some great research here in the US, trying to find different ways to improve the properties of nanotube filters to make them more useful for water filtration. This is actually an electron microscope image of what a filter made out of nanotubes could look like. So what you see, more or less, you can discern is vertical nanotubes there, like a forest of them, and they would be in a matrix of some sort of plastic, and then you would press water through so that it travels through these nanotubes and comes out clean the other end. When I began discussing this with the Tsinghua team, they had already done a lot of work. They had publications based on simulations they'd done. But frankly, like a lot of scientists, the work they could do with simulations was limited by the computing power they had access to. So a typical university team, at Tsinghua at least, and it's a very good university, they have access to maybe a few hundred computers in their data center for a few months at a time to do the simulations they want to do. So that really sets a limit on what they can do.
So this is where we come into the picture. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how did the sort of collaboration with IBM come about, and what were you hoping to get out of working with us on World Community Grid?
Right. So yeah, luckily I knew about World Community Grid. I've known about you guys for years because I do a lot of work in citizen science and getting civic engagement in research. We actually set up in Geneva, where I'm based now, something called Citizen Cyber Lab, which is a collaboration between CERN, the particle physics lab, the United Nations, an institute for training and research, and the University of Geneva. And what we do there is try to develop methods that make it easier for the public to participate meaningfully in science. And one of the projects we worked on already since a decade ago has been using technology called BOINC. BOINC is a technology for distributing computing onto people's PCs in an easy way. It's an open source platform developed by a guy called David Anderson at UC Berkeley. And we held one of the first meetings on how to use this in science at CERN, and IBM's World Community Grid was present there, one of the early adopters of this technology. So I've known about this philanthropic model that IBM has going for a number of years, and the focus is on humanitarian and health projects, so I thought, maybe this could be a really good project for you guys. So what happened is, in practice, I asked Ming Ma and his colleagues, hey, what would you do if you had a lot more computing power? Not like 20% more or 2 times more, but like way more, like 100 times more or 1,000 times more computing power. And the first reaction was, well, sorry, Francois, but we don't think that's possible. And then, when I convinced them, I showed them the stats from World Community Grid, they said, well, we need to think. And actually, it's not obvious when you suddenly ask a scientist, what would you do if you had 10 or 100 times better tools than you already have, right? Like the analogy I would give is it's a bit like Galileo. If you asked him, what will you see through the telescope before he looked, right? It's not obvious what they're going to do. But after discussing this for a while, we came up with a research plan that we thought would be pretty convincing, and then we got in touch with World Community Grid.
And the research plan was definitely very compelling for us. Maybe you can explain how you were going to approach your research and what you were hoping to get out of this research effort.
Sure. So what we thought was important, what we could do with so much more computing power, was really get to grips with how the water is flowing in practice in these filters. You see, the research that had been done up to then using simulations, basically the scientists used a trick. So in the simulations, you can normally only simulate a very short period of time, like less than a nanosecond, less than a billionth of a second of the water flowing through. And in order to see the water doing anything in such a short time, the trick is to speed up the water flow to a very high rate, like 100 or 1,000 times more than in a real filter. And then in that short nanosecond, you can still see something happening. And so you essentially, you're taking a sort of extreme example in order to be able to detect some measurable results in the simulations. So that's okay. You can kind of extrapolate from these very high speeds down to the realistic speeds of water flow in filters. But extrapolation is sort of linear, and you could ask yourself, well, maybe something's going on at these lower speeds that doesn't turn up at high speeds, so it might be worth doing the simulations at these much lower speeds and seeing what's out there. So it was really a bit of a shot in the dark. Just like Galileo, so I just put this up to remind you, I mean, Galileo started to look through the telescope at Saturn, and he didn't know what was going on. He saw these, weird things next to Saturn. He thought it was maybe ears or something on Saturn. It turns out Saturn's rings, he was starting to resolve them with the telescope. So from our point of view, it was the same sort of shot in the dark. Let's see what goes on at these low speeds. Does water really flow the same, or is there something new out there? If there is something new going on, it's bound to be important because it's happening under the realistic conditions that are relevant in filters.
I think you can see why this was compelling for us to get involved. But Francois, maybe you can talk about the early days of the project and sort of your early findings.
Right. So, well, first of all, we pitched all this idea to IBM, and you have a process of selecting, which is, you have external reviewers, and luckily we were selected, and we were very glad. So then this world community thing gets going, and, people like Gerard and hundreds of thousands start processing data for us, and like in a period of weeks, we had more data than this team at Tsinghua had managed to gather in 2 years. And I remember Ming Ma's eyes was like boggled, like, wow, this is amazing. And, the servers were filling up with data at a great rate. And, it didn't take long before we started to discern in the data that was coming back something new, something unexpected. And so, that was sort of confirming that it really had been worth looking with this much more powerful system.